What's going on, everyone? It's Daniel here with Kizuna, and today we're back with another video of our Ask Me Anything series. Today we're going to be speaking with Alisa Lynch, who's the Chief of Interpretation over at Manzanar. And since we didn't get a chance to actually visit Manzanar this year, Alisa's going to be sharing some experiences of children and young adults while they were incarcerated. If that sounds interesting, let's hop into it.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Nitahara. I'm Kizuna's Executive Director, and today we're really lucky to be joined by Alisa Lynch, Chief of Interpretation at Manzanar National Historic Site. Hi, Alisa. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, you just did, but my name is Alisa, and I've worked at Manzanar National Historic Site since September 9th, 2001. And Chief of Interpretation at Manzanar is not about interpreting languages, but about interpreting the history and the stories of the place. And so that's what I do, and the rest of the interpretive staff does at Manzanar. Day in the life of a Manzanar Ranger. There's many facets to the job. And I always look at it, it's kind of like we're a bridge between two groups of people who might not ever meet each other. And so one of the key groups we work with are the people who are incarcerated in Manzanar and their families. And so we do oral history interviews, we collect museum artifacts, we help families do research, through rosters and through ancestry. We have the relationship between the former incarcerees and us, and between the visitors and us. But our hope is to be, in some ways, almost invisible, so that when people come to Manzanar, they feel like they have met the people whose stories we are sharing. The other part of the job is running the operations at Manzanar, which we usually have around 115,000 people come in per year. And so some of those people were, in a camp, or they know the history, or they have a family member. But there's other people who come in because literally they saw a brown sign on the highway. We've literally had people come in who have no clue about the place. And that's okay, because our work there is to try to help people increase their understanding. It's just trying to get people to understand that this is an important part of our history, not just Japanese American history, but American history. And what I always tell people I look for is a passion for history and compassion for people. And if you have those two elements of your personality, you can be a Manzanar Ranger. For kids, a lot of the experience in Manzanar depended on where they came from. So you had some kids who came from places like Little Tokyo, where there were tons and tons of Japanese American kids around. And many of them came to camp and already knew other kids. But there are also people who came from more rural areas. One of the people, Saburo Sasaki, who volunteers at Manzanar, does special school programs, he talks about how as a 7-year-old kid, it was amazing to come to Manzanar because all of a sudden there were all of these kids around. We do have a classroom replica at Manzanar, and that's because the school classes were held in the barracks. At first, they did not have schools set up. And they had, I know the Catholic nuns tried to set up some summer school. Other people, worked on that and trying to get some school classes because there were so many thousands of kids running around. And eventually they consolidated the elementary school into Block 16, which is kind of in the middle of the camp. And the high school was consolidated in Block 7. When the U.S. Army exiled thousands of people from the West Coast, I'm not sure that they really thought of things like schools. 2/3 of the people in Manzanar were 18 years old and under. And so you have a bunch of young people who have been pulled out of school. You also have a lot of preschoolers, many of whom didn't speak English yet. It wasn't until the fall really that the War Relocation Authority, which is the civilian agency that ran the camps, started working to set up a school system. And Manzanar's curriculum actually was based on a curriculum developed by Stanford University. Early on, there were not books, there was not furniture. People were sitting outside in the dust, or they might be sitting inside on a piece of cardboard. And it's like so many of the things in Manzanar, it changes over the 3 years, 8 months that the camp is open. Some of the teachers were employed by the War Relocation Authority, and some of them came in to help and support Japanese Americans. The two biggest motivations were either to help the people who were in camp, and in some cases, like Mary and Ralph Smeltzer, they came to Manzanar as teachers in order to help people get out of the camp. And you can contrast the experiences of the War Relocation Authority teachers with Japanese American teachers who also were teaching at Manzanar, and where a Caucasian teacher might get, like $2,400 a year, Japanese American teacher would get about a tenth of that. Manzanar met all the California state school standards, so they are, it was legitimate diplomas. And so the classes that graduated there were 1943, 1944, 1945. Most of them now are, I would say, in their early to mid 90s. To me, they're always teenagers because, we always think of them as who they were in camp. But I've asked a number of them from the class of 1944, like, why is it that your class is so active? Several people said it was because for the class of 44, the camp was up and running. Like, class of 43, they were still kind of setting up the schools, getting things going. They graduated outside on an outdoor theater stage. Class of 44, the camp was kind of in full swing at that time. And so many of them felt like they had a more complete high school experience, down to having caps and gowns and class rings and yearbooks. Each class had a yearbook, and those are available on the Densho Digital Repository. The first one was called Cardinal and Gold, and it doesn't have pictures, it's just kind of typewritten. Second one, 1944, is called Our World, and it has pictures of the entire camp. It's like a yearbook of a community. And then the last one, called Valediction, is much shorter again, because by the time the class of 1945 was graduating, a lot of people were being relocated or were relocating out of the camp. There were a lot of people who got their career starts in Manzanar. Like, a lot of high school kids worked in the hospital as medical transcriptionists or orderlies, or just different things that they might not have ever thought of getting a career in a medical field. But suddenly, when you're in a place where everyone is Japanese American, there were opportunities that presented themselves. If you wanted to have money to get, a soda or a snack or a comic book, you really needed to work to have the money to spend. It is interesting because Manzanar is run by this agency called the War Relocation Authority, but most of the employees in the camp were Japanese Americans. So there were all kinds of jobs that people could get, even at a young age. I know somebody who was working in the administrative mess hall when he was like 12 and 13. But there were also efforts to get students out of Manzanar. There was a group called the Nisei Student Relocation Council, and it was a group that would help people get out of Manzanar and go to a school in the Midwest or the East Coast, because they couldn't come back to California. So there were a number of people who were helped through that project. And sometimes they would move out and maybe take a job as a schoolgirl or a schoolboy. They would refer to people as schoolgirls as schoolboys, who were kind of like a live-in housekeeper or babysitter. But there were people who would take jobs and then go to school on the side. One of the stories I think that is not as known about Manzanar is that it was the only one of the 10 camps to have an orphanage. Some of those kids were orphans before the war. And so they came mostly from 3 homes, which was the Salvation Army Children's Home in San Francisco, the Shonien Orphanage in Los Angeles, and then some of the kids from the Maryknoll Children's Home, which was a Catholic orphanage. Those kids, came to Manzanar, to what was known as the Children's Village. Lillian Matsumoto, she and her husband Harry ran the orphanage about the first year and a half. She said the Army gave them the options to remain in LA if they wanted to. But she said she didn't think it would be normal for the children because they were under guard. The phone line had been cut, and they were this little island of Japanese American kids in a city where there was tremendous hatred. She said, we chose to come to Manzanar, and they were actually able to tell the Army where they wanted the children's to be built. She talks about being on the bus, and one of the little girls stood up, I think she was pre-kindergarten, and she stopped and she sang "God Bless America" on the bus. And Lillian remembered that there was an MP at the front of the bus with his rifle, with the bayonet on the end. And she said, as the little girl sang "God Bless America," that MP stood there, but he had tears coming off his face. There were also kids that ended up there because of, the war situation. Like maybe they only had a single parent, and maybe that person got sick, or maybe they were arrested and interned. There were, some kids, there were 3 kids there who were half Alaskan Native. Their dad was Japanese American, their mom was Alaskan Native, and the father left the family, and those 3 kids ended up in the orphanage at Manzanar. Well, the school had, a lot of classes and activities. Like there was a young teacher named Louis Frizzell who taught drama and music. He's very popular with the kids. And in fact, if you ever see the movie Farewell to Manzanar, he actually plays himself. It was interesting because he would write these plays, and the kids, would help to produce them. When I say kids, I mean high school kids. They had opportunities that they might never have had outside of camp, like, to have a Japanese American kid playing the romantic lead in the play. You had, cultural things like kendo and judo, but you also had baseball and basketball and football. Big Pine, which is a town about 30 miles north of Manzanar, their football team came into the camp to play a game. And they, a lot of the Big Piners are kind of these big, rancher guys. And they thought they were going to prevail because they were much bigger than many of the Nisei kids. The Manzanar kids won the game 30-0. There was later going to be a basketball game in Bishop, but the parent teacher council canceled it the day of the game. So the kids were very upset of not being able to play against Manzanar. And I'm guessing that the Bishop parents did not want, their kids to get trumped by the Manzanar kids. There were also a lot of social clubs. And, there's the Modernaires was a girls' club. There was a baseball team, the Dusty Chicks. There was a baseball team for older guys called the Has-Beens. A lot of those clubs, it's been really interesting. We had there's a program called Qatari through Manzanar Committee, where they bring, people from Nikkei student unions to Manzanar, and then we always have elders who meet them there and share some of their stories. And one of the young women who came talked about belonging to a club called the Calico Cats. And she talked about her club advisor, who was named Grace Maruki. And I had the week before spent the night on the futon of Grace Maruki and her sister Rosie Kakauchi. And so I could literally hold up my phone and say, here's Grace today at 98 years old. It's really amazing considering how many people were in the camps, how many connections you hear of between people. I hope most of all that people learn to see in others, that we all have a common human experience. And those universal things that everybody knows, love and loss and happiness and excitement and joy and, and betrayal, and that those are human experiences. So I can understand what people went through. And I think about, how would I feel if that happened to me? How would I feel if I had to leave behind my cats and my dog? What if my husband was arrested and taken away? So I think the most important thing is for people to see common humanity. And all history is stories of people who came before us, but they're the same kinds of things we deal with. I hope that people have learned over all these years that, it's important to stand up and to speak out for yourself, for others. The reason that Manzanar is a National Historic Site is not because the federal government that I work for came and said, hey, let's make this a historic site. It was because Japanese Americans like Sue Embry and the Manzanar Committee and other people fought to say, this is our history and it's American history and you've got to preserve it. There are all kinds of stories told in this country But I think it's amazing in the last few decades that we've started to tell some of the stories that are not the ones we're proud of. So help other people speak and yourself speak out. Look around you and record history.
And that's it for this week's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to leave us a like down below and subscribe to our YouTube channel at Go Kizuna. That's it for me today. We'll see you in the next one.